instead of being someone trying to argue for the flourishes and nuances and brilliance of Black performance, why don't I just evangelize in the name of what's already happened? And that was a much more joyful book to write.
I'm Michael Tamblyn, CEO of Rakuten Kobo. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest today is the writer Hanif Abdurraqib, author of the book A Little Devil in America, Notes in Praise of Black Performance. This is his third book of prose, following his debut, They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, which we've talked about in this show in a Staff Picks episode, and Go Ahead in the Rain, Notes to a Tribe Called Quest. He's also published several volumes of poetry and written about just about everything you expect a person with smart things to say about culture might write, and everywhere they might write it. And don't just take my word for it. Last year, he was awarded a McArthur Fellowship, a prize known in some circles as the Genius Grant. Hanif Abdurraqib, welcome to Kobo.
Gosh, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
You had a big year in 2021. Your book, A Little Devil in America, came out in April. You received the McArthur Fellowship in September. The same book is nominated for a National Book Award in October and then wins the Gordon Byrne Prize. How's that all feeling for you right now at the beginning of 2022?
Yeah, I mean, oddly, I feel like I know people don't often believe this, but I actually don't think about it much. It's hard for me, I think, to kind of get caught up in even the pleasures of decoration, because I that really takes me out of the fact. I mean, I really just am someone who is devoted to the work, and like requires a lot of space, mental and emotional space to get to and remain immersed in, the pleasures of the work. And so while I'm grateful for all those things, I think they're kind of, they feel fleeting in the face of the hope, at least, that the work will endure. And that's kind of, where I'm always at, and where my head is always at, is kind of, if I get too wrapped up in this, then I'm maybe floating a bit outside of where I want to be, which is kind of locked in on what's next. Some of this, I think, is from a sport. I grew up playing sports at a decently high level, and I think it's one of those things that's just built into my engagement, where it's like, to achieve anything means there's kind of something else left to chase after, and for me, like, those achievements don't even come in the form of these decorations, but they come in the form of like this real generous opportunity I have to write for a living, which is, not everyone gets that, and so, I don't want to sit in awe of it for too long, and I want to allow myself some time to feel good, but I also want to remind myself to get back to the work.
And so it's a combination of feeling fortunate to be able to do the job, combined with that one play at a time, one drill at a time, one game at a time that comes from being a soccer player.
Yeah. It's still, I mean, and I think too, like I very much have to focus on what's right in front of me, and I move really quickly, I think. I get very excited. I want to keep moving on ideas and all of that. A Little Devil in America is interesting because it was the first book. Undoubtedly you talk to a lot of people, and I talk to a lot of writers who have the same thing where, like, yes, the book is out in the world, but by the time the book comes out, you've like lived with that book for a long time, and you might have something new that you're ready. This happened to me with poems all the time, where it was like the book of poems came out and I'd have to read out of the book of poems, and I would love those poems still, but I'd be like, well, damn, I got, in the meantime, I wrote all these new poems, A Little Devil in America is the first book where it was like, by the time it came out, I was still so in love with it and not yet done with it. And what felt most celebratory for me was to continue to immerse myself in the world of that book, to keep going down the rabbit holes that book afforded me and all these things. And so this is, I will admit, the first time that I've had a book that I have not yet wanted. Well, now I have moved on to something new, but for a long time, I didn't want to move on from it. And so the awards and stuff were nice, and they felt great as far as achievements go. But I was still so in the world of that book. It felt like I was still writing it.
Well, let's take advantage of that, because this is it's absolutely a book that one could immerse themselves in. And A Little Devil in America is about Aretha Franklin and Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston and Soul Train, but it's also about funerals and about how music can be a vehicle for salvation, and how we act with our elders, and various kinds of complex and complicated magic. And the line through it all is Black people and Black performance. And can you tell me a bit about how that came to be the organizing principle for this book?
Well, I mean, a big thing, the question of it for me was, okay, so it bears mentioning that this was not always the track the book was on. So I feel like I have to say that first.
Okay.
Initially, the book was, I had written this thing about this thing that still exists online. There's a link to it that I wish I could share, but no one will see it. But I wrote this thing about Justin Timberlake and Al Green and Elvis in Memphis. And it was talking about it was when Justin Timberlake was doing that like Man of the Woods. And so it was talking about the malleabilities of appropriation and how appropriation is often more complex than the sometimes binary conversations around it. And how Justin Timberlake has gone through many modes of appropriation and worn them all, I don't know well, but uniquely, in a way that's unique, definitely unique to him in his career. Mm-hmm. And so the book was going to follow this through line about appropriation, beginning with minstrelsy and working its way up through hip hop and, popular culture, contemporary popular culture. It's wild because I just saw, I got like one of those like anniversary posts that come up on our social media and whatnot. And so I just saw the original, like, what's those announcements? Is it Publishers Weekly or the Publishers Lunch announcements type things? I saw the original announcement from back in 2017 that had outlined what the book was sold as. And I was like, damn, it had a different name and everything, didn't it? It had a different name. Yeah, it had a different name, had different everything. So I got that and I was like, this doesn't even sound like anything, But halfway through working on it, I found myself exhausted by the fact that even though I didn't want to, the book almost, on the track that I had determined for it, that track required me to center whiteness to a degree that like I just wasn't excited about. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize that would happen until I started writing the book. And it was like, well, this is kind of happening organically because the stories I'm telling need this. And then, this thing happened where I was writing about Don Cornelius, and I had asked I had a connection. I knew somebody who knew somebody, and they got me a hard drive of every Soul Train episode from like the early 70s to the late 80s.
Oh, wow.
Like every single one. And so I stayed up. I just watched them all. This was at a breaking point for the book where I was like, I don't think this book is going to be what I want it to be, mm-hmm. but I still want this book to be, It wasn't like there was never a point of abandonment. It was always just like, this isn't what I dreamed it to be, and I think it can be better. And I was in the midst of that, and I was watching these Soul Train episodes every single night. Like I would watch like four or five every night for months, really months. And I came to this conclusion where I was like, well, what if this doesn't have to like, I could tell, what if I told these stories without that kind of centering? Or what if I gave in to the reality that in some cases, if what I'm hinting at or what I'm trying to actually get at is the permanence and exuberance of Black performance and the pleasures of Black performance, why don't I give in to the reality that in some ways the book has already been written? If I look at these Soul Train lines and I look at what's happening in the kind of joyful container of Soul Train that was built, that's the essay. The essay's already written itself. And so then how do I switch the part of my brain that insists I need to make an argument to convince the public, and instead switch on a part of my brain that says, well, no, my job is to be an evangelist for what has already occurred, because I don't want to argue about the glory of Soul Train. What is there to argue? As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing to argue, right? And so that was a real revelatory moment for me to say that instead of being someone trying to argue for the flourishes and nuances and brilliance of Black performance, why don't I just evangelize in the name of what's already happened? And that was a much more joyful book to write. That was a book that was much more exciting.
And you open this book with the first essay is about Soul Train and is about Don Cornelius. And so why does that make the perfect setup? What's the what is it about that experience, whether it was the watching of them, in this massive binge watch, or watching them when you were younger, that sets up this idea of that celebration of performance so well?
Yeah, well, I opened it with that in part because that was the essay that turned the book around for me. Mm-hmm. But I also opened it that way because it was this perfect moment, because in the essay itself, there's a revelation, a brief one, I think, but one that I hope is potent enough, where it's, the thing where I go into the Soul Train line in the dance marathon as an act of endurance in loving someone beyond the limits where you believe you are capable of loving him. And that, I think, was a perfect starting point to say, what you're reading is maybe not it's not about what you think it's about. And I'm going to nudge you gently in this other direction for a little while, just so that you can expect that this book is going to be a book of those nudges, repeated nudges. And so, one of my mentors always told me that, like, you can train people how you want them to read your work based on, like, sequencing does that for you. Mm-hmm. Like, sequencing sets up expectations on an album too, or anything, right? Any kind. I mean, albums, and I learned this from albums where, the way an album is sequenced teaches me how the artist wants me to hear it. And I think books should do the same thing. And I had an opportunity there to offer these small, gentle voltas within that larger piece that inform people, that set up an expectation that this book itself is going to be in the business of turning some things on its ear.
As much as you talk about performance in this book, you talk about audience, the other side of the coin, the other half of that relationship, and especially the audience's need to categorize or distill an artist down, even though an artist can contain multitudes. And you go all the way back to vaudeville with Black Herman and Burt Williams literally passing out or dying on stage. And a metaphor that, as you say, is like extended through decades. I'd love you to talk a bit about that tension that you feel between that relationship and that idea of audiences uplifting versus audiences demanding of the performer.
Yeah. So, okay. One thing I have to say that's wild to me is that, and I don't know, I can't speak confidently because I did like limited research on this, but enough to say that so Black Herman and folks Black performers passing out and or dying on stage and the audience thinking it was a part of the act, that was like not entirely uncommon. Like that happened often enough, right? And it was just, so that when I found that out so early in my research process, and it just messed with me. Like it was messing with me for a long time. And I didn't really quite know how to unravel the way it was messing with me. And I found myself like eternally kind of chipping away at these questions of audience expectations, and even indicting myself a bit, right? And asking myself questions of the expectations that I have of artists to fulfill what my expectations are that have almost nothing to do with them and everything to do with me. And it was a real interesting ride to be on because I felt like through that self-indictment, like, yes, there were expectations that were absolutely unquestionably racialized, right? Mm-hmm. But when we're talking about Josephine Baker, there were those questions were also gendered, and those questions were also it was important for me to, I think, to seep into what my complicity has been in the past as audience member, as viewer of someone doing something spectacular, as someone who like continually wants and wants and wants. Um, and that was um, uniquely challenging, worthwhile, truly, but uniquely challenging for me too. And I don't know if I came up with any good answers on the other side of it, except to say that, I think to be a performer is to give yourself over to expectations that might be entirely detached from your personhood. And that kind of surrender of control is jarring and has some real, tangible outcomes that aren't always in the favor of those who are doing the work.
And what I found especially interesting about the way you frame this is that there's that exchange between performers and audience that is just kind of natural to the arrangement. It's how we treat all artists. You are the experience that you deliver to me.
Right.
But then there's that additional dimension that's created by the distance of difference. A black
Yeah.
performer in front of a white audience, or black and white people together in an audience experiencing
Right.
a performance in a different way. And there are probably 3, 4, 5 different versions of that through the course of this book that you explore and touch on in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, it was important for me to because this was a book about black performance. While it was important for me to, I think, decentralize the broader specter of whiteness, it was also though important for me to not decentralize the impacts of performing to white audiences or folding towards the desires of white collaborators or these kind of things. And I thought the trickiest balance was doing that work while still lending a real fullness and humanity to the people I was writing about. I mean, a perfect example of this is Mary Clayton, I think, who I really was desperate to write about in a way that pushed her to be known beyond, the moment in Gimme Shelter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was a real vital thing for me. And to give a fullness to her still ongoing life. I mean, she released an album last year. That was great. And that's one of those things where it was a task in some ways to say, how do I present a person to the public with dignity and affection, particularly when they maybe have not always been treated with that kind of generosity.
And this is something that you've been turning over in your writing for a while now. Oh, I'm thinking back to 2016 and the article you wrote for MTV called Nina Simone Was Very Black.
Oh
And,
yeah,
where you said America so frequently is excited about the stories of Black people, but not the Black people themselves. And, again, it's that, what do people in an audience take from a performer? What's the value that they impose on them? And, and how does the performer end up on the other side of that? Um, and so do you find that your thinking around this has sort of evolved or changed over the years, or are you chipping away at the same stone?
well, I'm chipping away at a similar stone. I mean, of course, my thinking has evolved, but my obsessions rarely do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think my thinking around my obsessions evolve frequently, but at the core, I'm not entirely sure that my obsessions themselves don't really evolve or don't they kind of don't change, or at least they become more malleable as I get older. But I think at the core I'm still interested in the broadest possible sense. My container of affections remains intact, but
You describe a lot of situations that are about being, quote unquote, the only one in a room full of white people, whether it's at punk shows or at a screening of Three Billboards outside of Ebbing, Missouri. Is is this something that's heightened your awareness of what audiences are doing when they're watching performance? often being, that one different from all the others in that in that setting.
I think it maybe used to. I mean, now I don't really think about it anymore.
Uh-huh.
I think there was a point in my life where I thought about, and to be fair, I'm not often in those situations anymore either. I think, particularly in the past handful of years, it's so rare that I'm in situations like that. But I'm also just like kind of I've stopped spending as much time trying to unravel that kind of phenomenon of like how do I figure out my presence or the like white audience presence in relationship to what we're consuming at once at the same time.
Mm.
Part of that was, that Three Billboards thing. I pulled that part of that essay from a piece that was like from when the movie came out. So that part of that essay I pulled that from, years ago. And that experience like was wild. That experience kind of me up to a degree where I was like, I don't even know if I can get inside the psyche of this or if it'll do me any good to pursue getting inside of the mind of what's happening here. And so I think that I've kind of departed from that particular investment. It just didn't feel like it was working for me.
You have personal experience of grief and mourning, but you've also made kind of a close inspection of it over time. And it features in your first collection of poetry, The Crown Ain't Worth Much, and it shows up here as well. One thing that really struck me was you explore the two sides of mourning someone or something that we've lost. Mourning with loss and sadness and longing to return versus mourning with celebration and gratitude.
Yeah.
And can you talk to me a little about both the tension between those two and why it keeps coming back in your writing?
Yeah, well, I think it definitely keeps coming back in part because I feel required to understand grief as something beyond just kind of immovable in terms of its weight.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've lost so much, and I've lost so many people I love. I've lost so many things I love. Like many people right now, I've lost time, like actual time. And there's I think something that I'm really interested in terms of how do I make this experience of loss tenable? How do I make it tenable not just for me, but for other people who might endure it? And how do I frame loss and grief as something generous and not only something that can render us, that can devastate us? And so I'm understanding grief as the primary color or the center of a great many things, but I understand that grief is something that has a lot of working parts. It's the engine or the machinery of grief has a lot of moving parts, and to honor all those moving parts, I think brings me at least a little closer to a joyful endurance, because I think without that, it would be really hard for me to move through the world. If I'm almost required to imagine and steep myself in a reality where grief is not only, a somewhat immovable force.
I'm interested in what books meant to you when you were young.
Yeah, what's wild is I grew up reading fiction. And I say that's wild because I don't read a lot of fiction now. Not because I dislike it. I just fell out of practice with, I think about reading as a practice, and I fell out of a fiction reading practice. Although last year I picked it up and I read some more. I read about like 5 fiction books. But growing up, I read only fiction. And it was fascinating for me because, so this thing happened when I was growing up where, I grew up in a house, we didn't have a lot of money, but my parents did value reading. And so, they kept some books around and let us read, let me and my siblings and I kind of read freely. But then when I was like 11, a library was built down the street, like walking distance. And that was really the thing.
Game changer.
That was like, that like unlocked everything for me because it allowed me to just kind of sit and, particularly on summer vacations when it was too hot for anything else, I would kind of just find myself sitting in the library in the air conditioning and reading, and no one made me leave and no one kicked me out, and librarians who saw me in there a lot would would see the stuff I was reading and recommend books to me. Mm-hmm. And that was like immensely formative for me because I had never had people even notice me, let alone say, oh, it seems like you like this. Here's something else you might like, and that was really great. And so that was big. I was big into fantasy. I actually just got, I feel like a lot of people sleep on Lloyd Alexander. I don't really remember Lloyd Alexander much, but and I think his work is maybe lost to, canonically at least, is lost to eras that also held stuff like, the C.S. Lewis stuff and Narnia and all that. But Lloyd Alexander, the Prydain Chronicle specifically,
yes.
I read that and still read that every year. I just got a set. I just got a first edition signed set.
Oh, wow.
Because I really just wanted to have those books mean the world to me. When I was 11 years old, I first read them, and I read them every single year. Every single year. I carried those books with me forever. Like I would go to, folks know some of my background of some of my story. When I was like dealing with housing insecurity and all that, and I didn't have a place to stay, I would go to the libraries because, they would let you in, and I would just read those books. And I love those books so much. And I think that those books, not to get too like high level on Lloyd Alexander, but I think those books actually taught me a lot about, I just love that he wrote a boy character or a male character who was so deeply flawed by, like, entrapped in his own ideas of masculinity that it just fucked him up, mm-hmm. And he had to learn these things through multiple hard lessons. I loved that. I loved the slow evolution of Taran, and I appreciate that differently now as an adult. But when I was a kid, I don't know. I actually cannot believe. And this isn't like me making a pitch but I cannot believe that those have not been made into films. I know we got that like terrible Black Cauldron animated thing a long time ago, but I actually cannot believe, it's stunning to me that those books have not been made into films by now.
And those ones grabbed me, and I think were my gateway fantasy. Like they were the ones that just grabbed me and pulled me in, and in a way that some of the other, the world building was complex, but it wasn't like there was this massive hurdle of like invented languages and stuff that you had to crawl over in order to get to it. So you didn't bounce off of it like you did with, say, Tolkien or something like that. But you're right. They just kind of vanished from the popular culture and have never gotten their 32 episode Netflix deal that
it is so strange to me. I don't know. A part of me for a long time was like, how did this happen? There had to be something that made it so that these books truly vanished from.
There's an estate problem or something.
There's got to be.
Yeah.
I mean, it has to be, because it really, like, even if they don't ever get put on screen in any way, they're actually like they've kind of vanished from the cultural lexicon or the cultural canon. Mm-hmm. Like when I bring them up to people, sometimes people will be like, oh yeah, I kind of remember those. But a lot of times people are like, nah, I don't have any idea. And I think a lot of people know the Black Cauldron maybe because there was that like cartoon movie. Yep. Even though that movie kind of didn't hit the way I think people expected it to. But those books, man, like that story arc and that narrative arc, it's just spectacular. I don't know. I read them again last year. I'm gonna read them again this year. I'm a little nervous about cracking the first edition ones because they're like obviously like old as shit. But
No, you need a backup set.
yeah. So I got to get just like the paperbacks. I got to get the
Yeah.
original or those like paperbacks. But those are the books that stand out from. I mean, that there are a great many, but those are the ones I'm thinking about today.
So as a complete sidebar, while I was going through your list of works on Kobo, it was revealed to me that you have just written a children's book, Sing
Yeah,
Aretha Sing.
yeah.
And so tell me how that came together.
I gotta say, like so much of that, the credit for that goes, I think, to Ashley McBride, um, who, you know, illustrated it because uh, the work itself was really, I don't, I wrote that in like a couple hours. It's like 1,200 words. I had gotten asked to write a children's book, and Aretha had passed away a while before that. And I thought about, yeah, I just grew up in a household where music was always playing and people were excited about music and invested in music. And the ways that stories were passed down about music and musicians when I was growing up were never, though they were done well and generously and all that through my elders, there was never like a tactile thing that I could touch and hold and look at. And so I thought a children's book, about Aretha seemed appropriate. And really, the illustrations were tie it together and are that make the book, and that are the engine for the book. And I just played a small role in lending some language to those beautiful illustrations. And so I don't know if the children's book world is for me. I really enjoyed doing this, but I don't know, that might be I think that might be out of my realm from now on.
Were you someone who was always writing one way or another, or was there a switch that flipped and you decided that you're doing this now?
No, I didn't start writing until I was um maybe, I mean, I started writing um sort of seriously in my early 20s, late teens, early 20s. That was mostly for zines. I grew up in a punk scene, and the thing about zines is, you have to report on what's happening on the scene,
Mm-hmm.
or you have to report on what's happening where you are, so that other people can get a feel for where you are and what's going on where they are, and these kind of things. And that was kind of a vital experience for me because it shaped my voice as a critic and as a deliverer of good news. Um, someone who felt like I could be exuberant about the things I was seeing and excited about. Um, and so, yeah, like that is kind of how the writing began. But I never, I didn't start writing seriously until, well, who's to say what serious is? I didn't really start writing with any kind of intention to write as a life until I kind of found poetry. Um, and that was around
Mm-hmm.
2012. And, it's funny, I never, I really never wanted to do anything except publish one book. I wanted to publish that book of poems, and that was it. By that, I mean The Crown Ain't Worth Much. Um, that was the plan. That was it. And I was, at the time I was working a job and I was excited about that job, or not excited about that job, but, the thing was I'd had I got in trouble when I was younger, and I had like a record, and getting a job, like getting a quote unquote, big air quotes here, traditional 9 to 5 type job, was an achievement at the time because, it was hard to get hired with a criminal record. And so my whole thing was like, well, I gotta, writing is something I can do on the side, and I'll publish this one book and feel really good about it. Um, and obviously things changed, but I was really excited to kind of immerse myself in the world of writing.
It sounded like poetry for you was also this mix of solitary pursuit on one hand and performance on the other. You did poetry slams in Columbus,
Yeah, yeah, that's how it came up. That's
and still do, I think.
no, no, I'm out the game on that. I've been for years, but yeah, I mean, but I though I owe a great deal to the poetry slam world and the scene, and I mean, I was still, I don't really, well, none of us really get out anymore, all like that, but um, I, whenever I would tour, I would still put a poetry slam venue or two on my tour schedule because those are the kind of places where the reception for the work is what I crave, right? To hear people responding to your work in real time. Poetry Slam taught me a lot about real time feedback and sound, and how sound and pleasureful sounds can inform the writing and editing process. And this kind of, I don't really care about competition or the competition part of the poetry slam, but I got so much out of putting my work in real time against the work of writers I admired. And not even in a competitive way, but in a way to say, okay, how am I sounding? How am I looking? What can I learn? It's always, always, always been a question of what can I learn? And Poetry Slam offered me a kind of really massive opportunity for that.
And Columbus seems to be one of those places where that culture is really strong. Like there's a lot of that going on there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Columbus, of course now the pandemic has slowed things, but when I was coming up in the poetry community here, there's no better place to be but Columbus, if you ask me. And I'm sure, some East Coast folks might disagree, but there was a point in Columbus where you could hit a different poetry night every single night of the week if you wanted to, Monday through Friday, sometimes on the weekends, and all of them were different. And all of them had great writers, but all of them were different. And so that was really fulfilling. Because again, it was always, always a question of what can I learn and how can I add new things to my bag. And so, that's that was like a big, big thing for me, was just kind of allowing myself patience and allowing myself to be sort of a sponge.
Right.
And so that was like the big thing is, how do I learn patience, and how do I know that I am incapable of conquering all at once. And poetry, coming up in the poetry slam community in Columbus really taught me that.
So you have these two tracks of writing that are kind of evolving and growing in parallel. You have poetry on one side. You have this growing body of work as, as you say, initially like a music zine writer, but that growing into a broader cultural commentary with music at the center. Did you just let these two things grow in parallel, or were you kind of switching between one and the other?
No, I let them grow together. I didn't think that I thought the way I wrote could translate to, I think I just needed the language, I needed to know how to wrap language around my interests in a way that was compelling and that had some beauty, and in a way that got people and held people. That was what I didn't have. I had all my excitements, and I had all these kind of, I had the conversational exuberance, but I just didn't have the ability to outline some beautiful language to ascribe to these things. And so once I began reading poetry specifically, it really opened up some things for me. And so, yeah, I always thought, well, I'm excited about music, and I'm excited about popular culture, and I'm excited about this kind of, ever evolving relationship with nostalgia that not only I have, but a lot of people have. And I think I just need words for it. And I think to this day, I'm still kind of in the pursuit of the words.
With music and nostalgia, you've written a whole book inspired by your long-standing admiration for the hip-hop group A Tribe Called Quest.
Yeah.
And you've written a long, passionate essay about the emo band My Chemical Romance. Your a fan of Carly Rae Jepsen. Do you have a sense yourself of what it is in music that grabs you or hooks you, or is it always a surprise to find yourself falling in love with something?
Well, I still chase that surprise, certainly. I still pursue the feeling of surprise. And I think that's one thing that brings me back to music is that I'm always open to and excited about. I haven't heard everything. I haven't heard every way that everything can be done. And therefore, I know that I am still capable of being surprised and I'm still open to the reality of surprise, which means that I have to pursue listening with a real joyful aggressiveness in a way. Um, and that is kind of one thing that brings me back is the reality of what might be waiting for me on the other end of that pursuit. Now, another thing is that um, I think that I return to songs I love because I'm fascinated by um, the way that songs can kind of stitch their way along the emotional landscape, even though that landscape has changed for me with age or time or experience, right? I'm fascinated eternally by the way that songs live in the heart and mind, even when we've kind of evolved past their origin point. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm also, someone who's always, always, always invested in returning.
You also, you root those things in time, and in memory. You also do an amazing job of rooting them in place. You've lived other places, you've done residences and fellowships, but you have come back to Columbus. And when we're young, our home is just our home. It's the center of the universe. But then we get older, and if we're lucky, we go some places and we see some things, and then coming home is a conscious choice.
Right.
So I'm interested in what brought you back and what it's been like to root yourself there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, I love Columbus. Being here and being in a place that I know and understand the nuances of and understand the corners of is vital for my creative practice. But more than that, being in a place where I learned how to be a creative person is vital for my creative practice. Being in a place where I am surrounded by people who knew me and loved me well before I wrote anything, not just anything quote unquote worthwhile,
Mhm.
but anything, means that there's a type of fullness that people see me with that I think allows for a real care and a real openness with how I'm treated here. And so, um, coming home was an easy thing for me, um, and to make a home here has meant a lot. And particularly, I think during the past 2 years, I've been back in Columbus since 2017, early 2017, but particularly past 2 years, it's been a real experience, a real joyful experience to get to be home and to get to kind of re-ground myself in the realities of being held in familiar territory.
And you have a mural now. Is that how you say
Yeah,
it? You have a mural. You are a mural.
I suppose. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That was really kind and generous, and that all that's a lot for me. But I really appreciate. I just think if you can, it's just a real pleasure to be in a place where people are excited to celebrate you while you're still among them, um, and that is the kind of place Columbus has always been, and not just for me. I think there are, I'm like um, one in a great lineage of artists who have carried forward the missions of a lot of artists who came before me, and so it's just an honor to kind of be in a place that taught me how to do this work and to get to do the work here.
When you were younger, you talked about struggling in the world in a lot of the different ways that we mean struggle. Would you say you're more comfortable in the world now, or is the struggle still there?
I think it's just a different struggle. I mean, you know, with it's this the struggles for me have always been a constant evolution. Um, I think I'm more mature now, and so the ways that those struggles manifest themselves are the ways they kind of rattle around in my head and in my daily living. Um, Maybe don't lead to the same decision making process that they did when I was younger. But yeah, I mean, I think there's an evolution of these struggles that feel to me um, that like you know um, I am never going to be without. And so what I think I have to do instead, and what I've had to do instead, um, was build a life that acts as something that can endure, and much like I was talking about with grief, a life that is comfortable with seeing um, these struggles or the emotional byproducts of these struggles as something that is not just daunting or um, rage or sadness inducing. There's another side to this too, and um, I am hopefully learning how to be a better person, and in turn learning how to be a better artist through a lot of these processes.
As an observer of people and culture, would you say that you are the kind of person who observes from a distance, or do you try to close that distance as much as you can and get as present and as close as possible?
Well, I mean, I think in real life, I definitely observe from a distance, in part because, um, I'm an anxious person, and I do think that those anxieties require me to keep the world at a distance um, in order for it to be comfortable for me. Um, in order for me to really assess it well, I need to be at a distance. But I think the writing is where I get to close that gap a bit. Writing is kind of where I get to shrink the distance between me and the world that I might be too afraid to get too close to or too anxious to get too close to. Um, the world that I have no problem brushing up against, but also, uh, you know, don't want to get too close to. And so I think writing really affords an opportunity for me to continually close these gaps that I build through observation, and um, to ask some people to come along with me. To kind of reinforce the reality that none of us are in the broader this, whatever we define as this. None of us are in it alone.
And that was something that really jumped out to me um, in the reading of your most recent book, and also in your poetry as well, that you talk to the reader a lot. You address the reader directly. You ask them to come along with you,
Yeah.
and in your poems as well, there's this feeling of, it's love letters to friends. It's you really do feel that collapsing of the distance between you as a writer and us as the people holding the book.
Yeah, that's important to me because there are times where I think the direct address acts as a breaking of the fourth wall and also removes the kind of hierarchy between reader and speaker, or reader and writer, if we were to call it that, um, and offers an ability to kind of say, we're here kind of alongside each other. And therefore, if we treat it like this, if we are to understand that we're here alongside each other, then you no longer are required to look at me as an expert. You're maybe, hopefully, required to think of me, or not even required to, but offered a path wherein you can think of me as someone as curious as you were when you picked up this book. Because that is kind of who I am and who I remain. Um, I hope to be a vessel for multiple curiosities at once. And I think to break down that hierarchy lends itself to a real honesty about what my intentions are when it comes to what I want to read about and speak about in discussion.
And it also seems to engage back to what we were talking about earlier, that idea of uplift and celebration. The in that direct address, you're inviting people to come along with you. You and you engage with them with affection, and it's so you get to feel both a participant in the work and a celebrant of the work at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, that's I think, I came up on music scenes that were richly communal in nature, where bands, punk bands, underground scene bands, they would play these small shows, and if the shows are sold out, if kids couldn't get in or whatever, they would find somebody's basement after the show and play a second set in the basement,
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I carry with me, because I mostly want people to have access to what I'm excited about, and I want people to be able to, I want it to be touchable to everyone. And so I'm always writing towards that post-show basement vibe. I'm always writing towards that kind of thing, where we can be present with each other and feel like we're in a space where questions can be asked and not necessarily answered.
You were awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, which sort of exists for the sole purpose of giving people who are very, very good at something the chance to do more of it without having to worry for a little while. And some people roll into it with a project that they've always wanted to do. Some people start something completely new. What do you think you want to do with that time?
I'll get more sleep.
Excellent.
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think things could just keep rolling the way they do. Like, whether or not I got the MacArthur, I still have a book that I'm working on that is due this year that I got to put my head down and work on. I still have Object of Sound, the music podcast I do, that is rolling into its excitedly rolling into its third season. So many of my projects are just projects that I was doing before. Now, I think this is maybe a better, because I got that a lot. I got that question a lot. And I always tell people it's maybe a better question for like 3 years down the road.
Mm-hmm. It's better to ask 3 years from now, like what germinated during that time? Like what started when you had that slap?
Yeah, because it's not like and I know some people who have approached the MacArthur this way, I suppose, where it's like they get the MacArthur and they're like, I'm going to do this, and this. But for me, it's like, well, these things I'm excited about I was already chasing after them before last summer or last fall or whenever.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's on my mind now. But there undoubtedly before the end of the year is going to be something I dream up. I don't know. Maybe I'll try to get someone to let me make films out of the Lloyd Alexander books.
Hanif, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. This is a real pleasure. And, I hope y'all stay warm out there. I think that it's tough, the second go round of the pandemic winter kind of thing is interesting, because for me, at least in the Midwest, or at least this part of the Midwest, you get into these like January, February parts of it, and it's just like relentless. And so I hope folks are, both y'all out there in Canada and folks listening are treating themselves generously.
I've been speaking with Hanif Abdurraqib. His latest book is A Little Devil in America, Notes in Praise of Black Performance. You can find it and all the books we talked about at Kobo and Conversation's home on the web at kobo.com/conversation. Check the show notes for a link. Make sure to catch every conversation by subscribing wherever you listen, and leave a rating too. You have an infinite number of stars you can give away in your lifetime, so send some our way. Kobo and Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamlin. Thank you for listening.